a guy named Mike Miller, who's a colleague of mine at UC Santa Barbara now, and he was studying how the brain retrieves memory. And that seems kind of cool. The only reason I say it's mundane is that there's probably like 50 studies or more that show us how the brain retrieves memory. And back then, if you would have said, what do we know for sure from neuroscience, I would have said, we know the areas of the brain involved in memory retrieval. So Mike Miller somehow got this money to do a study that we seemingly already knew the answer to. And he does his study, and he produces his map of the average brain. And if we can go to the slide, this is it. This is Mike Miller's average brain. And you'll just have to trust me. It looks just like the average brain of almost every other study that looked at memory retrieval. But being the good scientist that he is, Mike actually didn't stop there. He had told me that during one of the runs of one of the participants, he saw their brain scan, and he said, it looked a little weird, and that's a technical term, but he said, it looked a little weird. It didn't look much like the average that was produced. So he said, hey, I wonder how many of the individual people in my study, how many of their brains actually looked like the average brain? So he went back and looked at every individual brain. And let me show you just a few, just for clarification here. Note that all of these people performed at peak performance, so there are no performance differences. Here's one subject's brain. Areas in blue are the meaningful areas that were involved in memory retrieval for them. There's 2, there's 3. I can go on and on because not a single brain looked like the average brain. So Mike got worried. He didn't rush out and publish it because that's how you ruin your career. Some mistake. But about 6 months later, he did something really important. He brought the same subjects back to his lab, put in the exact same scanner, gave them the same task, and got the exact same result. The average still represented absolutely nobody, but what was really cool is that each individual brain, their pattern stayed the same. There were unique ways that each brain was retrieving memory in a high-performance way. And this insight led us to understand that there were multiple strategies the brain could use to retrieve memory, relying more on verbal, relying more on spatial, visual information. So Mike Miller was the first to show us that there was no such thing as an average brain. And importantly, if you built theories of brain processes off of averages, those theories may actually apply to nobody at all. So we've made good progress there. And what's really important is that this insight, that the average represents no individual, has not just played out in neuroscience. It's been at the core of every advancement in every field over the last decade or so where we've started to look at individuals. So for example, we know now there's no such thing as an average cell. There's no such thing as an average genome. There's no such thing as average cancer. And in what might be the most important insight, from my perspective, for the future of the education system we're talking about, there's no such thing as an average student. Now, I don't think that's controversial in this room, right? But this is called a pregnant pause. I guess I'm supposed to say something important now, but I don't think it's controversial to say that we know that there's no average student because we're all here trying to change a system based around averages. But if you just accept that basic idea, then we do start to see the heart of the problem. Because for whatever good this system has done, and it's done plenty of good, our current industrial model is absolutely rooted on the assumption that there is an average student, that is a meaningful reference point to build systems of education. And if you just think about it, even today, in most states, textbooks are expected to be age appropriate, which sounds really good, except for it just means designed for what the average kid of that age knows and can do. Think about a lot of these norm reference standardized assessments that Susan talked about. These will compare kids to a hypothetical average student. And even the pace and sequencing with which kids learn in our schools are all based on what we know about learning on average. And it's actually not that shocking that we have this kind of system, because the architects of our industrial system were the same folks who had integrated this thing called scientific management into factories. And it works really well to use average-based systems in factories if you could treat employees like cogs, where you don't really need to know much about them. But again, I'm not saying this is the end of the world. We had really good improvements. This kind of industrial system was the best we could do at the time, but we all know that we need something different. We know that the goal of the system is changing. And if we want to get to a place that really nurtures kids instead of batch processes them, that thinks about the cultivation of talent in a highly equitable way, average systems don't work. And you need a new kind of system that is rooted in a deep understanding of individuality.